Hey there, come a little closer to the fire with me. There is a kind of silence that does not feel empty. It feels intentional, like a door that was closed very gently, long ago, and the soft click still hangs in the air if you listen hard enough. Tonight, I want to take you into that silence, because somewhere, in the oldest clay tablets on Earth, in the little wedge marks pressed into wet earth and baked hard by time, there is a haunting absence, a place where the story should say, and then the gods left, or, and this is the final decree, or, and here is the last day they walked among us. But instead, there is only a fade, a thinning, a slow retreat that leaves behind empty stairways and forgotten names. And if you stay with me, we will follow a trail that feels almost like dust on your fingertips. We will stand where ziggurats once rose like mountains of mud brick. Then we will turn and notice the strange pattern of memory itself, how a civilization can remember its gods, like living neighbors for thousands of years, and then, somehow, forget them without ever noticing the moment forgetting began. We will touch a few unsettling details along the way. The temples that emptied with no farewell, the divine council that turned into underworld judges, the way a single city's god can suddenly become the supreme ruler of the cosmos, and the quiet fact that when worship stops, the gods in this tradition do not merely feel distant, they lose their place to dwell. If that kind of mystery pulls at you, if you want more slow journeys through the places where history and myth overlap, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories find the people who need them. And if you feel like it, leave a gentle comment with where you are listening from tonight. I always love imagining the map of candlelit rooms across the world. Now, let the room dim a little. Let your shoulders soften. If your jaw is tight, unclench it gently, as if you are letting a secret slip out between your teeth. Breathe in, slow, and breathe out, slower still. The fire can do the thinking for a while. You can simply listen. I have always found it strange, honestly, that the greatest disappearances are not the loud ones. They are not the ones with trumpets and collapsing towers. The greatest disappearances are the quiet ones. The kind that happen while life continues, while bread is baked and rivers rise and fall, while someone writes a receipt for barley on a tablet and never suspects they are living at the edge of an ending. So let us begin where the ending refuses to announce itself. Imagine you are standing in the ruins of Uruk, not the Uruk of songs and shining walls, not the Uruk where scribes hurried through courtyards with damp clay in their hands, but the Uruk of now, 5,000 years after the city's loud heart stopped beating. The plain around you is wide and pale. The air has that dry, steady patience that deserts keep. Wind moves across the ground in thin layers, lifting grit and letting it fall again. It sounds like someone slowly brushing sand from stone. If you were standing here with me, I think you would notice the quiet first. Not a peaceful quiet, exactly. More like a quiet that has swallowed 1,000 voices and is still hungry. The walls that once stretched for kilometers are no longer walls. They are long, low ridges, as if the earth tried to remember their shape but could not hold the thought. You step carefully, because the ground is uneven, with fragments of mud brick that crumble when you press your heel down. Each step makes a small sound, a soft crunch, a sigh of dust. Your clothes catch the wind and flutter at the edges, and somewhere in that fluttering, your mind reaches backward without even trying. You picture a stairway, steep and wide, climbing in hard angles toward a shrine at the top of a ziggurat. You picture the way morning light would have hit the bricks, warming them, and the way the whole city would have looked up, as if the sky itself had a front door. Now, look again. The ziggurat is not a mountain anymore. It is a weathered hill. Its clean lines are rounded by centuries of rain and sun and neglect. It has the shape of something that used to matter, and this is where the story becomes unsettling in a very particular way. Because if you go hunting for the moment the gods left, you do not find it. Not in a clear sentence, not in a final tablet, not in an inscription that says, "On this day, the Anunnaki withdrew their presence and returned to the heavens." There is no neat ending. Instead, there is a shift so subtle you can miss it unless you read the tablets side by side like layers of sediment. The earlier words feel close, personal, present tense, almost. The gods argue. The gods eat. The gods get offended. The gods show up in dreams and storms and rituals, like temperamental rulers you have to keep pleased. Then, slowly, the language changes. A god who once felt like a neighbor in the next room becomes a force, a principle, a title, a name that still exists, but with less warmth around it, like a fire that has burned down to ash yet still holds heat if you press your hand near. You know that feeling when you return to a childhood house and everything is smaller than you remember? The doorway, the hallway, the backyard. Your memory has not lied, exactly. It has just enlarged what mattered. Now imagine a whole civilization doing that with the divine. Imagine a people whose daily life was built around feeding and dressing a god, around climbing a ziggurat that was literally designed as a place where heaven and earth could touch. And then imagine that, over centuries, the touch begins to feel less certain. The tablets keep speaking, but the voice changes. There are pieces of this story scattered across millennia. Not one text that holds it all, but many texts that hint and adjust and correct and sometimes contradict. That is part of the eerie beauty of it. It is not one author. It is a long, slow conversation carried by scribes who never met, written into clay that still remembers the pressure of their hands. Some nights, I picture those scribes very clearly. A small room, cool even in summer because the walls are thick, a low table, a shallow bowl of water to keep the clay workable, a stylus made from reed, its tip cut to make that wedge shape. The scribe leans forward, breath steady, and presses. Press, lift, press, lift. Each mark is simple. Together, they become a world, and somewhere between those marks is the silence we began with. We call it the disappearance of the Anunnaki. But that phrase can mislead you, because it makes you imagine a departure, like travelers packing and leaving. It makes you imagine footsteps fading down a road. The truth, at least the truth as the evidence feels when you hold it in your mind, is stranger, more gradual, more like the tide pulling back, leaving wet sand that still glitters for a while before it dries and cracks. So tonight, we are not chasing a spaceship. We are not hunting a dramatic evacuation. We are listening to a civilization change the way it experiences the sacred until the gods become distant, not because they flew away, but because the structures that made them feel present, the temples, the offerings, the rituals, the language itself, begin to thin. And if that sounds too abstract, let me make it simple and very human. In Mesopotamian religion, a god is not only believed in, a god is served. The god has a house. The house is a temple. Inside that temple is a statue, and that statue is treated like a living body. It is washed, it is dressed, it is fed, it is sung to, it is carried in procession. It is protected like a king. So imagine, for a moment, the last morning in Uruk, when the doors were opened and no one came. Not because the people were suddenly atheists, not because someone announced a new philosophy, but because the city was poorer now, because the empire had shifted, because the old priesthood had thinned, because the taxes and grain that once supported the temple had been redirected, because another god city had become more powerful, because new rulers preferred new stories. The doors stay shut. Dust gathers on the threshold in a delicate line. Candle smoke is replaced by plain air. The statue waits in the dark. and in a worldview where presence is maintained through service, waiting too long becomes a kind of disappearance. This is the atmosphere we are stepping into, you and I, beside this fireplace, listening to a story that begins with silence and ends with an echo. In the next part, we will do something that feels simple but is strangely important. We will ask what the word Anunnaki even means. We will see how the name itself shifts like a shadow on a wall, and we will follow the way writing, bureaucracy, and empire taught the gods to behave like administrators, until the divine council starts to look like a cosmic government, and then, later still, like a set of judges waiting in the underworld. For now, just breathe with me. Let the wind over Uruk become a slow, steady sound in your mind. Let the dust settle. Let the stairway that no one climbs anymore exist for a moment in candlelight, and feel how quiet can be a kind of evidence, too. A clue that the most important changes are sometimes the ones that happen without anyone ringing a bell. Before we leave Uruk, let us linger the way you linger at the edge of sleep, not rushing, not demanding answers. Sun-warmed clay has a dry sweetness to it, like old pottery. When you breathe in, your throat cools for a second. When you breathe out, the air carries your warmth away as if it has all the time in the world. You take a few careful steps, and your shoe presses into grit that gives a soft crunch, then settles, then forgets you. In a broken brick, you can almost see a fingerprint, blurred by erosion but still human. Someone shaped that brick when the city was alive. Someone stood under a harsher sun, wiped their brow, and kept working because the temple needed another layer, and the god needed a house that touched the sky. And you can almost hear the old rhythm if you listen with the part of your mind that remembers dreams. The splash of water in a canal, the murmur of trade, the slow beat of sandals on packed earth. A hymn rising and falling, steady, meant to soothe a power that could bless a harvest or dry a river. Then the wind passes again, and the sounds fade, and the simplest question remains: where did they go? Not the people. Cities fall for reasons we can name. I mean the ones they called the Anunnaki, the High Council, the princely offspring, the names spoken in morning rituals as naturally as family. The tablets do not give us a clean ending. No single line says, "This is the day the gods departed." What they give us is more unnerving and more believable. A slow change in tone, words that grow distant, a sacred presence that feels less immediate. Sometimes I picture a priest climbing the ziggurat steps long after the golden age had dimmed. The bricks are still stamped with royal names. The stairway still climbs. The priest carries a tray with bread and beer, smaller now because the storehouses are not as full. At the top, the wind steals warmth from the skin. The priest sets the tray down and speaks the hymns anyway, but the air feels different, a little colder, a little thinner, as if the room does not fill the way it used to. The priest does not say, "The god is gone." The priest says, "Perhaps we have failed," or "The signs are unclear," or quietly, "Perhaps the god is elsewhere." And that is how absence begins, not as a decree, but as a mood. So tonight, we will follow that mood across time. We will keep our hands on clay and our feet on dust. And when we reach places where the record becomes debated or uncertain, we will let it stay that way, like a shadow at the edge of the firelight, not frightening, just waiting to be noticed. And if you have ever walked through a museum gallery late in the day, you already know this kind of waiting. The lights are gentle, the air cool, the floor smooth beneath your feet. Behind glass, a clay tablet sits like a small, sleeping animal. You lean closer and see the wedge marks. Press and lift, press and lift. And you realize the haunting thing is not only what is written, but what stops being written. It is a silence preserved in baked earth. Let that thought settle softly as we move forward, just a little farther, and we will start naming the council, the titles, the shifting numbers. But for now, Let Uruk remain a dim outline in your mind, and let the fire's quiet crackle guide you into the next room of the story. The word itself is the first doorway, and like many old doorways, it does not open cleanly. Anunnaki. Say it slowly in your mind, and feel how the syllables settle, heavy as clay. I have always found it strange that we speak the name as if it points to one fixed group, like a roster carved in stone, when the oldest texts do not treat it that way at all. The term is old, yes, but it is also slippery. It behaves like a category more than a club, a label that can expand, contract, rearrange itself depending on who is speaking, when they are speaking, and what their city needs the gods to be. Some scholars translate the name as princely offspring, or those of royal blood, tied to the idea that these beings are descendants of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth. Even that little family tree, though, has roots that twist. Names change from Sumerian to Akkadian. Pronunciations soften and harden. Spellings shift as scribes copy older tablets and make tiny choices with their stylus. You can picture the process, can't you? A scribe with inkless hands, only damp clay and a reed. The room is quiet except for the faint scratch of the stylus tip. A candle smokes gently at the edge of the table, the flame bending when someone opens a door. The scribe glances at an older tablet, its surface worn from years of handling, and then presses the new marks into fresh clay. Press, lift, press. That is how a word survives for millennia. Not as an unchanging jewel, but as a living thing passed from hand to hand. So, when we ask what happened to the Anunnaki after they left, we have to begin with an honest admission. The very word Anunnaki is not a single, stable fingerprint. It is more like a set of footprints in sand, clear in places, blurred in others, sometimes overlapping with other tracks. In early Sumerian thought, the Anunnaki are often the great ones, the decision makers, the divine council, the beings who decree fates. But even here, the texts can feel uncertain about exactly which gods belong under the umbrella. Later, when Akkadian-speaking peoples absorb Sumerian culture, the word shifts again. It becomes Anunnaku, Anunnaki. The sound changes, the grammar changes, and modern scholarship ends up standardizing a form that is convenient for us, even if it is not perfect for the originals. And I want you to notice something very gentle and very unsettling in that. A civilization invents writing, and one of the first things it does is organize the sacred. Writing appears in Mesopotamia around the late 4th millennium BCE, and at first, it is not poetry, it is not myth, it is administration, lists, inventories, measurements, how many jars of beer, how much barley, which worker received which ration. It is the language of a temple economy, of a city learning to count itself. And then, almost inevitably, the gods begin to look like that system. As above, so below. Not as a mystical slogan, but as an organizational chart. If the king of Uruk has officials to oversee canals, granaries, labor, trade, and war, then the cosmic king in the sky must have officials too. The divine realm becomes a bureaucracy because the human realm has become a bureaucracy. The Anunnaki, in this view, are not chaotic spirits drifting through wind and water. They are administrators. They have jurisdictions. They have roles. They have responsibilities. Reality itself feels managed. You know that feeling when you open an old drawer and find papers from a life you barely remember? Receipts, notes, tiny proofs that you once worried about things that no longer matter? Mesopotamian tablets can feel like that, except the drawer is 4,000 years deep, and the papers are clay. One text speaks of 50 Anunnaki, connected to Eridu, the ancient holy city associated with Enki. Another tradition speaks of 7, who act as judges in the underworld. Later, in the Babylonian creation epic, often called Enuma Elish, compiled around the late 2nd millennium BCE, The numbers swell dramatically. Hundreds assigned to heaven, hundreds assigned to the underworld. A grand total that feels almost like an empire, trying to imagine the size of its own divine workforce. The inconsistency is not a mistake. It is a clue. It tells us the Anunnaki are not a fixed caste. They are a flexible way of talking about power, about authority, about the parts of the cosmos that feel too large for human hands. And in the earliest layers, certain names keep rising to the surface, like bright objects in dark water, and distant and high. The sky itself made personal. Enlil, wind and storm, a force that can flatten fields and also fill sails. Enki, wisdom and fresh water, deep in the Abzu, the subterranean realm, imagined as a vast body of sweet water beneath the earth. Ninhursag, the mother, the shape of fertility and the weight of hills. Inanna, the moon, traveling patiently across the night. Utu, the sun, the steady witness. Inanna, fierce and complex, love and war intertwined, like two threads you cannot separate without tearing them. Sometimes these are spoken of as the ones who decree fate. Sometimes the group shifts. Sometimes the label Anunnaki floats above them like a banner. And here we reach a point where it helps to breathe slowly, because modern ears often stumble. There is a popular idea, repeated in books and late-night conversations, that the Anunnaki were visitors from the stars, ancient astronauts, engineers in the sky. It is a seductive story, because it gives us a clean plot. They arrived, they built, they ruled, they left. But the tablets, as mainstream scholarship reads them, do not describe spacesuits or rockets. They describe gods, supernatural powers, beings whose movement between heaven and earth is mythic movement, not technological travel. Some scholars argue that when a text says a god descended, it means the divine presence became accessible, localized, in a statue, in a storm, in a vision, in a temple chamber, at the top of a ziggurat. Real in their cosmological sense, but not mechanical in ours. And if you let that settle, the story becomes quieter and, in a way, more intimate. Because it means the departure we are tracing is not about metal and engines. It is about presence and absence. It is about how a community feels the sacred, and what happens when that feeling changes. To understand that feeling, we have to step inside the daily life of a temple. Not in a dramatic way, just gently, like walking into a room where someone is already singing softly. Imagine dawn in a Mesopotamian city. The air is cool, the sky is pale. A servant moves through a corridor carrying a small bowl of water. The stone underfoot holds the night's chill. A door opens, and a warm smell drifts out. Bread, beer, incense, the faint sharpness of smoke. In the god's chamber, a cult statue waits. It is dressed like a ruler, not because the people were naive, but because this was how presence was maintained. The statue was treated as a body the deity could inhabit. Servants wash it. They adjust its garments. They speak hymns that are repetitive by design. Like waves, offerings are placed. The god eats the essence, and the physical food becomes the meal of priests and staff. The temple is not only a holy place, it is an economic engine. It owns land, it employs workers, it stores grain, it keeps records. And those records are written in clay, again and again, until the city's relationship with the divine is literally baked into archives. This is why the silence matters so much, because when offerings stop, when the staff thins, when the records cease, the presence the people depended on becomes harder to feel. The god is not slain. The god is not exiled. The god simply has nowhere to be. And the myths themselves tell you, with a kind of dark humor, that the gods needed humans too. In the Atrahasis tradition, humans are created so the gods do not have to labor, clay mixed with divine essence, a species made to dig canals, maintain order, serve the cosmic household. It is a disturbing idea, yes, but it is told with the calm directness of a people describing the world as they experienced it. Labor, hierarchy, duty. Later, when disaster comes in those stories, it is often framed as a disruption of service. Offerings fail, rituals go wrong, the gods become displeased, calamity follows. When the great flood stories appear, they carry this theme like an undercurrent, and afterward, boundaries are set. Mortality, limits, distance. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh, with all its adventure and sorrow, circles the same truth. A king, part divine, cannot conquer sleep, cannot grasp immortality. He returns to his city and points to the walls as the thing that will outlast him. And in that return, you can feel the gods stepping back, not walking away, not vanishing in a flash, but receding into a realm where humans can no longer demand answers, only interpret signs. So here is where part 2 ends, not with a conclusion, but with a slow opening. We have met the name and seen how it shifts. We have felt the bureaucratic heartbeat of the first cities shaping the divine into a council with roles and numbers. We have stepped into the temple at dawn and understood how presence was maintained through daily care. In the next part, we will follow the story forward through the first great transformations. Conquest, syncretism, new languages, new supreme gods. We will watch the council reorganize like a government after a revolution, and we will begin to notice something almost tender in its darkness. The way old gods, when they are no longer needed, are rarely erased. They are reassigned, sometimes to the underworld, sometimes into new names, sometimes into the quiet architecture of time itself. Let us slow down on one particular thread, because it ties so many of these ideas together. There is a Sumerian composition often called Enki and the World Order, preserved in versions written around 2000 BCE, but carrying older traditions, like a scent carried in cloth. In it, Enki moves through the world assigning functions, establishing balance, and distributing something the Sumerians called the me. The me are difficult to translate, and it is debated exactly how the ancients imagined them, but they are described less like abstract morals and more like tangible authorizations for everything that makes civilization feel like civilization. Kingship, priesthood, music, craftsmanship, truth, lying, herding, metalwork, even the shape of a festival, the rhythm of a hymn, the proper way to speak in court. The Anunnaki, as the High Council, are the guardians of these me. So when a text says they decree fate, it can mean, very concretely, that they decide which powers belong where, which city is granted legitimacy, which king is allowed to rule, which craft is permitted to flourish. And there is a myth that makes this almost playful. Inanna visits Enki. There is drinking and charm, and in a moment of generosity, Enki grants her a great bundle of me. Inanna gathers them like precious objects and carries them back toward Uruk. Later, Enki sends messengers to recover what he gave away. Under the play is something serious. Civilization itself is portrayed as movable, stealable, carried from one place to another. That is how history often feels when empires rise, skills and authority shifting, leaving some cities hollow and others suddenly bright with new power. Now imagine the ziggurat again with that in mind. Millions of mud bricks, bitumen sealing the outer layers, dark and sharp-smelling, drainage channels hidden inside, stairways climbing terrace after terrace toward a small shrine at the summit, a place imagined as a bedroom where the deity might spend the night and where offerings could be set down with careful hands. If the me can move, if the powers of civilization can be carried away, then presence can thin without anyone announcing it. A temple can feel full in one century and strangely quiet in another. No thunderclap, just a slow change in what people can afford. What they believe matters, what stories they keep repeating. Hold that image softly, breathe, let the fire crackle, and let the word me drift through your mind like small clay tokens, precious, easy to lose, easy to carry away. Sometimes, in excavations, archaeologists find bricks stamped with a king's name, a neat little claim pressed into mud. I built this. I served the god. Remember me. A name survives only as long as someone can read it. When the script is lost, the stamp becomes decoration, then texture, then dust. That is the deeper disappearance, the loss of fluency. The moment a hymn becomes sounds without meaning, and then, quietly, the singing stops. We are heading there now. We will leave the temple at dawn for a moment and step out into the street where the city is waking. Not the bright, loud waking of a modern place, but a slow unfurling, like cloth being shaken out. A donkey shifts its weight in a courtyard. Someone pours water from a jar, and the sound is soft, almost secret. The air smells of damp clay and yesterday's smoke. You can feel the ground under your feet, packed and slightly uneven, holding the cool of night. If you were standing here with me, I think you would hear the scribes before you see them. They move with purpose, tablets wrapped in cloth, styluses tucked behind an ear. Their world is one of measures and lists and seals, but their eyes still glance toward the ziggurat, because even in a bureaucratic city, the sky remains the ceiling of everything. This matters because the next turn in our story is not a single dramatic moment. It is a long pressure, like a river pressing against its banks. It is conquest, yes, but also mingling, blending, the slow rearrangement of names and powers until the old order is still present, yet quietly altered. Around the late 3rd millennium BCE, a ruler from the north, Sargon of Akkad, rises and builds something new in the region, the first true empire, some call it, a web of cities brought under one command. The details are debated, and the dates wobble slightly, depending on which chronologies scholars prefer, but the shift itself is unmistakable. Independent city-states that once competed like siblings are pulled into a wider structure. And when politics becomes larger, religion stretches with it. The Sumerians do not vanish. Their words, their rituals, their tablets remain, but now they share space with Akkadian language and Akkadian gods. Not as a clean replacement, not as a total erasure, but as a merging that feels, in hindsight, like two rivers meeting. At the point of meeting, the water is turbulent. You see swirls, you see eddies. Then, downstream, it looks like one river again, and it becomes hard to point to where one ended and the other began. This is the first great answer to the question that brought us here. The Anunnaki did not leave. They changed their names. An, the distant sky father, becomes Anu in Akkadian. Enki becomes Ea, still clever, still deep in sweet water, still associated with the Abzu. Inanna is absorbed into Ishtar, and in that absorption she gains new edges, new brightness, a sharper blade of war and a richer glow of desire, though we will keep that part of her story gentle, like a candle behind cloth. Even Enlil remains Enlil, stubbornly himself, wind and storm refusing translation, still the one whose moods are felt in the way the air can turn, sharp, then soft again, without warning. Even the word Anunnaki shifts in this meeting of tongues. Sumerian shapes become Akkadian endings. The term becomes more standardized, more like a label you can stamp on a concept. But beneath the label, the category remains flexible. The council can be many. The council can be 7. The council can be named differently depending on the city and the century. And here is the haunting part, because syncretism, that slow blending of divine identities, is not just theological creativity. It is also a form of forgetting that feels like remembering. A name changes, and the worship continues, and everyone believes they are still serving the same power, which in a sense they are. But something subtle has shifted. In the quieter corners of the story, you can sense how the old city loyalties keep trying to hold on. A woman leaves a small bowl of dates at a doorway shrine because her mother did, and her mother's mother before that. A fisherman ties a reed amulet to his net and murmurs a name that sounds Sumerian, even if the market around him is now full of Akkadian chatter. A child learns to say the names of the gods the way you learn to say the names of mountains, as facts of the horizon. And yet, on the official tablets, the horizon is being redrawn. Royal inscriptions begin to speak with an imperial confidence. The king is not just shepherd of one flock, he is shepherd of many. The language of rule becomes more standardized. Titles repeat. The same phrases travel from city to city like dust carried on wind. It is easy to imagine the gods resisting this at first, as if they were stubborn elders in a council. But gods, in this tradition, are also shaped by the way humans speak of them. Their power is real to the extent that it is enacted. So the enactment shifts. The rituals continue, but the framing changes. A hymn that once praised a local deity for guarding one canal might now praise that same deity for sustaining the order of all lands under one crown. I have always found it strange that the most dramatic changes in religion can be so quiet. No banners, no public announcement carved in stone that says, "Your gods have been updated." Just a new set of words, a new list of epithets, a new way of describing who sits at the top. And because the Mesopotamian mind loved organization, this new divine organization could feel natural, even comforting. When your world is unpredictable, a hierarchy offers the illusion of stability. The scribes understood this. They were, in a way, the engineers of memory. Their work was administrative, yes, but it was also devotional. Each wedge they pressed into clay was a tiny act of faith that order could be preserved, that meaning could be stored, that the universe could be managed the way a temple granary could be managed. A god who once belonged intimately to one city is now part of a larger system. The god becomes more universal and therefore less personal, less like a neighbor, more like a title. You can feel this change in the architecture of heaven. In the earliest city-state world, each city has its patron deity, like a household head. Uruk belongs to Inanna, Nippur to Enlil, Eridu to Enki. The relationship is almost local, like the way a particular river bend feels like it has its own spirit. But in an empire, local loyalties are inconvenient. The empire prefers a hierarchy. It prefers a single summit with many levels below. So the divine council begins to resemble an imperial court. There are still many gods, but their power is arranged. Their roles are assigned. Their disputes, when they appear in myth, start to read less like family arguments and more like policy disagreements. Even fate, that heavy word, begins to feel administrated. And because so much of Mesopotamian religion is tied to writing, the shift is preserved in the very shape of language. The tablets keep recording rituals, omens, lists of offerings, royal inscriptions that tie kingship to divine approval. Kings claim that the gods have chosen them. Priests interpret signs. Dreams are treated like official documents delivered at night. If you are sleepy already, let that image comfort you. Dreams as letters, the gods sending messages in the soft ink of sleep. Now, there is another layer we need to hold gently in our hands, like a fragile tablet. In the myths, humans exist to serve. This is said plainly in the Atrahasis tradition and echoed in other texts. The lower gods tire of labor. The great gods meet in council. A solution is found. Clay is mixed with divine essence, and humanity is formed. Whether we read that as literal belief, symbolic story, or cultural psychology, it reveals something crucial. The relationship is not based on abstract belief. It is based on service. The gods are maintained. So what happens when the service is interrupted? Empires rise and fall. Funding changes, temples lose patronage, priests are displaced, wars break canals and fields and make the distribution lists shorter. The number of loaves offered to a statue shrinks. The quality of cloth for the gods' garments becomes rougher. The incense burns thinner. There is no tablet that says, "We are closing the temple now." Instead, there are fewer records. A gap in the archive is its own kind of statement. The gods, in one of those darkly humorous moments, are described as swarming to the smoke of sacrifice like flies, desperate and hungry without human rituals. It is a small detail, almost playful, but it carries a heavy implication. The gods are not self-sufficient. They depend on the world that depends on them. This mutual dependence complicates any clean idea of departure. Even in times when the gods feel distant, the system assumes they still need a place, a house, a shrine, a daily routine of care. Presence is made. So when later generations look back and wonder why the gods are quieter now, they do not imagine the gods blasting off into the sky. They imagine a change in relationship, a distancing, a withdrawal into higher layers of heaven, or, sometimes, a descent into darker layers below. And that brings us to the most intimate and unsettling shift of this era. As Mesopotamian civilization grows larger, the gods begin to recede into abstraction. In earlier stories, the divine is immediate. A storm is Enlil's mood. The moon is Inanna, traveling. The river is not merely water. It is breath. It has a will. But as writing evolves, as the world becomes more legible through numbers and signs, the gods become less like the phenomena and more like the laws behind the phenomena. They become administrators of order rather than embodied forces. Some scholars would call this theological evolution. Others would call it political necessity. I think it is both, and also something quieter, a change in how it feels to be human. When you live close to the edge of survival, the sacred is everywhere, because the unknown is everywhere. When you build systems, canals, archives, and empires, the unknown migrates. It hides in deeper places. The sacred becomes harder to touch, and so it rises, it retreats, it becomes less like a neighbor and more like a distant authority. You can see this in the way kings speak. The early city kings present themselves as caretakers of a local god's household. Later, rulers speak as if they are part of a universal order, authorized by high heaven, ruling not only one city, but many. The gods are still there, but they are framed differently, and the Anunnaki, once the close decision-makers, begin to look like a civil service, a council that manages decrees, a set of powers that keep reality balanced. Not the loud, personal gods who eat at night and storm at noon, but the ones who sit behind the curtain of fate. This is why, when you stand in ruins like Uruk and search for an ending, you find a transformation instead. Now, before we go further, let us take a slow walk in your imagination. You are climbing a ziggurat stairway. The steps are wide, made for processions. Your hand brushes the brick and feels the faint grit. Bitumen has a sharp scent where it was used to seal and strengthen. The wind is stronger as you rise, pulling gently at your sleeves. Each terrace is a pause. Each pause is an opportunity to breathe. Below you, the city spreads like a pattern of clay and reed. The river glints in the distance, a long ribbon of moving breath. At the top, there is a small chamber. Inside, the air is still, cooler, a little smoky. A lamp burns with a steady flame that seems to hold the room together. The statue is here, the god's body, the place where heaven touches earth, not through metal, but through attention. You set down an offering. You speak a hymn. Your voice is low, respectful, almost like speaking to someone who might be sleeping. And then, because you are human, you wonder, is the god listening? In earlier centuries, the answer felt obvious. The city prospered. The harvest rose. The king won a battle. The signs were clear. Now, The signs feel complicated. The empire is wide. The world is noisy. The gods feel farther away. So you do what humans always do. You record. You make a tablet. You press marks into clay. You write down omens. You consult the patterns of stars. You ask the priests to interpret dreams. You try to make distance manageable by turning it into language. And in that effort, the gods recede further, becoming more like the patterns you study. We are moving toward a second great transformation now, one that will reshape the council even more dramatically. A new city rises in prominence. A new political center demands a new cosmic story, and with it, the Anunnaki will find themselves reorganized again, their ancient authority redistributed like me, carried from one hand to another. Keep your breath slow. Let your shoulders settle. Let the firelight play softly across the clay of your thoughts, because Babylon is coming into view, and with Babylon, a new name that will change the shape of heaven, Marduk. If you listen closely, you can hear the empire before you can see it. Not a roar, not a marching drum, but a steady tightening of patterns. A messenger arrives more often. A tax list grows longer. A seal impression appears on tablets in cities that used to stamp their own. The same royal titles are repeated, carved and pressed, and copied until they feel like a spell. And somewhere inside all that human reshaping, the gods are reshaped too. We are drifting now toward Babylon. At first, it is simply one city among many, a place with its own streets, its own canals, its own temple smoke rising into hot air. Then, over centuries, the balance tips. Political gravity pulls toward it. The details of kings and dates can be argued, and scholars do argue them. But the story in the texts is clear. Babylon rises, and when Babylon rises, its god rises with it, Marduk. In earlier times, Marduk is not the highest name. He does not dominate the oldest hymns the way An, Enlil, Enki, and Inanna do. But when Babylon becomes powerful, the cosmic story is revised in a way that is both brilliant and unsettling. The priests, the scribes, the court poets, they do not simply announce a new god. They compose a new narrative that makes the new order feel inevitable, as if heaven itself always intended it. This is one of those moments where you can almost feel the stylus moving. You can imagine the scribe leaning in, steadying the clay with one palm, the other hand pressing wedges that will outlast the king who commissioned them. The lamp flame trembles, then steadies. Outside, the city breathes. Inside, a universe is being reorganized. The story that emerges is often called Enuma Elish, when on high, a Babylonian creation epic compiled in its best-known form around the late 2nd millennium BCE. Though built from older pieces and older anxieties, in it, the cosmos begins in deep waters, not a peaceful sea, but a mingling of primordial forces. The details can vary in retelling, but the spine remains. Chaos rises in the form of a great sea power, Tiamat, and the gods tremble. They gather, they debate, they hesitate, and then a younger god steps forward. Marduk offers to face the chaos, but not for free. He demands authority, supreme authority, the right to reorganize the cosmos after the battle. The older gods agree, not because they are suddenly convinced, but because fear makes creatures bargain. This is political theology, and it is so human it almost hurts. There is a particular kind of night in Babylon that I keep returning to in my imagination. In the temple precinct, the hush is deeper. Servants sweep dust that will return by morning. The broom bristles whisper over brick. A priest rinses a cup, the water catching lamplight for a moment, before it disappears into a channel. The smell of cedar oil clings to cloth. The air tastes faintly of incense, sweet and slightly bitter. This is the physical world that Enuma Elish belongs to. It is not an abstract poem floating in space. It is something recited and remembered in specific rooms, under specific lamps. during festivals, when the city needed reassurance that order still held. During the New Year rites, the Akatu festival, the king would enact humility. The statues would be carried. The cosmic story would be spoken aloud, as if speaking it could pin the world in place for another cycle. The details of ritual vary across time and scholarly reconstruction, but the intention is clear. Repetition as protection, story as architecture. So when Marduk is elevated in the epic, it is not only a mythic gesture, it is a civic act. It says, Babylon's order is the cosmos's order, and it says something else, quietly, to all the older gods. It says, your authority is still honored, but it is now channeled through this one name. A city becomes dominant, and the heavens are edited to match. In the epic, Marduk defeats the chaos force and creates order from what remains. He establishes the arrangement of the stars. He fixes the calendar. He defines boundaries. He assigns roles to other gods, like a king, handing out offices to loyal administrators. Even the language of it feels bureaucratic, as if the cosmos itself is a newly conquered territory that needs governance. And what happens to the Anunnaki in this new order? They do not vanish. They are reassigned. In some versions, hundreds of them are named as workers in heaven and underworld, assigned to duties. The numbers are grand and a little dizzying, like an empire counting its own capacity. But what matters is the shape of authority. The council that once felt like the source of fate now becomes a staff, a divine civil service under a single supreme ruler. If you were standing here with me, you might feel a chill at that. Not because a new god is frightening, but because centralization always carries a quiet kind of tragedy. When many voices become one voice, something is lost, even if order is gained. The old gods are not killed, they are diminished. Their stories are still told, but they are told differently. They are made to bow, and this mirrors the human world so closely that it becomes hard to separate myth from memory. As independent city-states give way to centralized kingdoms and empires, the divine realm gives way to supreme gods. In Babylon, Marduk. In Assyria, later, Ashur. The trend is not absolute, not clean, but it is strong. The heavens adopt the shape of the palace. Some scholars argue that this is simply how religion works under empire. Others would say it reflects a deeper shift in human consciousness toward abstraction and universality. We cannot be sure which cause is stronger, and it may be that they are the same cause, wearing different masks. But we can feel the result. The gods become more distant, not absent, not silent in every sense, but less like companions in the street and more like powers behind the curtain. The intimate temple rituals continue, yes, but the myths increasingly emphasize order rather than personality. The cosmic system matters more than the gods' mood. And yet, even as the gods become distant, the temples remain intensely physical. Let us slow down and step into one again. It is late afternoon. Heat lingers in the bricks. You walk through a corridor where the walls are cool to the touch. The floor is swept, but dust still gathers in the corners because dust is patient. A servant carries a basket with folded cloth. Another carries a jar of beer, the surface dark and thick. There is a smell of bitumen, a smell of reeds, a smell of smoke that is soaked into stone. You hear water somewhere, a quiet trickle in a channel. The river is always near in these cities, even when you cannot see it. It is the breath that keeps clay alive. In the chamber at the top, the statue waits. It is dressed. It is adorned. It is treated as a living monarch. The ritual is repetitive on purpose, meant to hold reality steady. Each day, the doors open. Each day, the hymns rise. Each day, the offerings arrive. Each day, the god is acknowledged, so the world does not fall apart. And that is why the idea of departure, in this tradition, is not a matter of a god choosing to leave a planet. It is a matter of the routine weakening. If the offerings shrink, if the hymns are fewer, if the temple staff is reduced, If a new ruler favors a new shrine, then presence becomes thin, like smoke that cannot find a ceiling. In times of stress, people search for signs. They look to the sky. The Mesopotamians were extraordinary observers of the heavens. Their astronomical texts, their star lists, their omens, these are the quiet, patient work of generations who believed the gods spoke through patterns. A planet's brightness, an eclipse, a comet, all could be read as a message. And in later centuries, terms like Nibiru appear in these astronomical contexts. But what exactly Nibiru meant is debated. Some texts use it as a crossing point, a reference marker, sometimes associated with a planet like Jupiter, sometimes as a concept in the sky rather than a hidden world. The important thing for our story is that the sky becomes a page. When direct divine speech feels rare, humans become interpreters of silence. Priests gain power. Scholars of omens become crucial. Kings consult them before war, before building, before decreeing. The divine council becomes distant, but its will is still believed to be present in signs. The Anunnaki, in this climate, become less like beings who walk in temples and more like forces that administer fate through a network of intermediaries. And that brings us to another unsettling twist, one that begins to show itself more strongly as we move into the first millennium BCE. The word Anunnaki starts to drift downward. In earlier Sumerian layers, it can point to high gods, a council tied to heaven. In later texts, particularly in myths of descent and in certain ritual contexts, the Anunnaki become associated with the underworld. They become judges, chthonic powers, authorities of the realm where the dead go. How did that happen? It is debated. Some scholars suggest that the term Igigi begins to take on the meaning of the great gods of heaven, leaving Anunnaki to refer more specifically to those below. Others propose that the Anunnaki always had a dual nature, ruling both above and below, and that emphasis simply shifts depending on the story. And then there is a darker, more psychological interpretation. In many traditions, when old gods are replaced, they are not erased. They are pushed down, demoted, made into underworld spirits. This is not a moral judgment, just a pattern of cultural change. When the living world no longer needs a god as a ruler, the god can survive as a power of death. And here, almost inevitably, Inanna steps onto the threshold. We will not rush her story, because it deserves a quiet pace, but you can already feel the shape of it. A goddess descending, 7 gates, stripping away of power, a court of judges, a sentence, a stillness that feels like deep earth. That is where the Anunnaki will appear as 7 underworld magistrates, watching, deciding, not the bright council of heaven, but the darker assembly below. Before we go there, though, I want you to hold one more thought in your hands, as if it were a small clay figure warmed by the fire. The entire Mesopotamian system depends on continuity, daily offerings, seasonal festivals, priestly lineages, the ability to read and write the sacred scripts, the funding that keeps temples functioning, the political stability that allows rituals to repeat. When those supports weaken, the religion does not explode. It erodes, like a ziggurat in rain, like stamped bricks dissolving into plain earth. Later faiths will arrive, new empires, new languages, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Islam. Each will interpret the old gods differently, often harshly, sometimes dismissively. But even before those waves break fully, the internal transformations have already been shaping the Anunnaki for centuries. They have been renamed, reorganized, demoted, reassigned. So when someone asks, where did the Anunnaki go? The most honest answer begins to sound like this. They went where power goes when the world changes. They went into administration. They went into the underworld. They went into it cried, other names. They went into the patterns of time, the 6-0, minute, hour. The circles and calendars that still carry Babylonian mathematics like quiet fingerprints. And if you are feeling sleepy now, let that be comforting. The story is not about a sudden loss. It is about slow transformation. It is about the way nothing truly disappears all at once. It fades. It migrates. It becomes something else. In the next part, we will step through those 7 gates with Inanna, and we will feel the underworld not as a place of horror, but as a cool, silent archive where old gods wait, patient as dust, to be remembered again. Let your breathing stay unhurried. Imagine the clay tablet cooling, its surface firming as it lies on a reed mat. The signs are still there, sharp and angular, but the hand that pressed them has already relaxed, already begun to drift towards sleep. Outside, the river keeps moving, patient as always. We will do it slowly. For now, stay with the warmth of the fire and let Babylon fade into a distant glow behind your eyelids, like a lamp seen through a veil. Tonight, let us follow a thread that descends rather than rises. The fire beside me has settled into a slow glow. The room is dim, and the candlelight makes small, careful halos on the wood. If you were here, I think you would feel how stories can move like breath, in and out, up and down, gentle as the tide. The Anunnaki, once spoken of as high rulers of heaven, begin to drift in the text toward a darker register. Not evil, not monstrous, just lower, deeper, closer to the places where voices become whispers. And the best way to feel that shift is to walk with the goddess who chose to go down, Inanna. You already know her, even if you do not realize you know her. In one era, she is the bright star of morning and evening. In another, she is Ishtar, with a sharper name. But the pulse beneath the names is familiar. Love and war, attraction and cruelty, the soft hand and the hard fist. Mesopotamian gods are not tidy. They are weather. They are the river changing its mind. They are the way a human heart can be tender at dusk and relentless by dawn. In one of the most famous myths, Inanna decides to descend to the underworld, the realm ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. Scholars argue about the layers of the story, how old it is, how it evolved, what ritual dramas it might have echoed, but the spine is clear enough to hold in your hands. A goddess goes down, and the underworld is not a blazing hell. It is not flames. It is not screaming. It is something colder, a place of dust and still air, a quiet bureaucracy of the dead. If you close your eyes, you can picture the entrance, a gate set into earth and brick. The stone is cool when you touch it. The air tastes faintly of minerals. There is a dryness in your mouth that makes you swallow slowly. Behind you, the living world is full of birds and water and market voices. Ahead, there is a silence that does not feel empty, only settled, as if it has been waiting a very long time. Inanna approaches the first gate. She is dressed in symbols of power, crown, necklace, garments, ornaments. Each one is a statement. Each one is a kind of authority made visible. She knocks. The gatekeeper asks why she has come. Her answer is not simple. Sometimes she claims she is going to attend a funeral. Sometimes she declares her right to enter. The myth has edges like broken clay, different fragments catching the light. But the gate opens, and the rule is given. At each gate, something must be removed. Not as punishment, not as violence, but as procedure. A law of the underworld. To enter fully, you must become lighter. You must be stripped of what made you impressive above. And so the first gate takes one piece. Inanna pauses. You can imagine her breath. The faint clink of metal as an ornament is lifted away. The cool air brushing her skin where cloth no longer covers. She steps forward, and the gate closes behind her with a slow, heavy sound. Then the second gate. Another removal. The third. The fourth. Each time, the same pattern. Question: Answer, opening, stripping, closing. It becomes almost hypnotic, like a ritual repeated, until it turns your thoughts soft. 7 gates in many versions, the number itself carrying a kind of inevitability, a counting down, a shrinking number. And this is where the Anunnaki appear in their later role. Inside the underworld, seated like officials, are 7 judges. In some tellings, they are called the Anunnaki. They do not shout. They do not chase. They sit, and their stillness is its own power. They look at a goddess who has dared to enter their realm, now stripped of her bright symbols, and they render a judgment. In the myth, the judgment is harsh. We will not describe it with sharp words. We will keep it like a shadow behind a curtain. But the feeling is clear. The underworld does not care who you were above. Even a goddess cannot carry her full authority into the land of dust. Honestly, I have always found that moment strange in the best possible way. It is terrifying, yes, but also calming, if you let it be, because it says something quiet and steady. It says that there are places where posturing ends, places where titles dissolve, places where the world becomes simple, not in the way a child is simple, but in the way a deep cave is simple. Rock, silence, time. Inanna is held there, in that low place, and the living world begins to feel the absence. The myths often show this as a disturbance in fertility, in growth, in the ordinary cycles of life. When a goddess of power and desire is absent, the world above becomes sluggish. The animals do not mate. The grain does not rise. The usual movement of life slows, as if the earth itself is holding its breath. The other gods notice. And Enki, the clever one, the one who knows how to slide around rules without breaking them too loudly, begins to act. The way the myth tells it, Enki creates small beings, tiny messengers, made from dirt under his fingernails, or from the quiet stuff of the Abzu. The details vary, but the mood is consistent. He does not storm the underworld with force. He sends something soft, something that can slip through cracks, something that can listen. These little messengers descend. They find Ereshkigal in her own pain, because the underworld in Mesopotamian myth is not a place of triumphant evil. It is a place of sorrow, of separation. Ereshkigal is not a villain. She is the queen of what cannot be avoided. She is the ruler of the fact that everything that breathes will one day stop breathing. The messengers do something subtle. They mirror her grief. They agree with it. They sit with it. They do not argue. They do not preach. They simply listen in a way that feels rare, even in a myth. And in that listening, a door opens. A gift is offered. Inanna can be returned, but there must be balance. The underworld does not release without exchange. This is another of those dark laws that feel strangely soothing when you accept them. Not because they are kind, but because they are steady. So Inanna rises again, moving back through the gates, receiving her ornaments, her clothing, her symbols, one by one, like someone remembering who they are after a long fever. The air grows warmer as she ascends. The sound of water becomes louder. The living world returns to motion. But the myth does not let us leave with a simple relief. There is a price. A substitute must be found. And that leads to the figure of Dumuzi, or Tammuz in later traditions, the vegetation god whose cycles of absence and return echo the seasonal rhythms of dying and sprouting. Again, we will keep the story gentle. We will not linger on pain. We will focus on the slow pattern. A god goes down for part of the year, then returns. Lamentations are sung. The world mourns, then breathes again. What matters for our larger question is what the underworld scene does to the word Anunnaki. It places the term in the dark below. It makes the Anunnaki judges rather than creators, magistrates rather than lively council members who eat offerings and debate politics in the bright upper world. Whether this reflects a true shift in worship, a shift in terminology, or simply the needs of the myth, scholars debate, but the effect on later imagination is unmistakable. When you hear Anunnaki, you begin to picture a courtroom in the dust, and that, in a quiet way, is a kind of demotion, not a disappearance, not a departure, but a lowering. A god who is no longer needed in the day can still be needed in the night. A divine name that no longer rules the harvest can still rule the boundary between breathing and not breathing. This is one of the strange ways that old gods survive. They are not erased. They are moved. They become shadows behind the newer lights. Now, as you rest with this myth, let me bring you back to the physical world again. Because in Mesopotamia, myth and ritual are braided together like reeds. Picture a temple lamentation. It is evening. The courtyard is cooling. The bricks release heat slowly, like an animal sighing. A group of singers stands in a line. Their voices are low and wavering, designed to carry across stone without becoming harsh. Someone beats a small drum with the softest possible touch. A priest holds a tablet and reads, the marks catching the lamplight. The words are old, and even the reader may not feel every nuance, but the rhythm is familiar. People have been grieving in this pattern for generations. They are grieving for a god who goes down. They are grieving for the idea that something beautiful disappears. And in that grief, the underworld becomes real, not as a fire, but as a fact. You know that feeling when you walk into a quiet museum gallery and the air changes and you lower your voice without being told? That is the feeling I imagine for the underworld in these stories. A museum hush, a sense that you are among things that have outlasted you. The Anunnaki, in this atmosphere, are like curators of the boundary. If that makes you uneasy, let it soften. Let the unease become a kind of calm respect. Because the story is not asking you to fear. It is asking you to notice the shape of human thought, how we place our oldest powers into the places we cannot control. And the underworld is, finally, the place we cannot control. Now, if we follow the timeline forward, the world above continues to change. Empires rise, languages shift. Priests keep writing, but the writing itself becomes specialized, guarded, an art that fewer hands can perform. The temples still stand, but their funding and their political protection are not guaranteed forever. The grand ziggurats begin to feel like monuments rather than living ladders. And in the midst of all that change, people keep asking the same question in different forms. Where did the gods go? Some answer with myth. A goddess went down and returned, but not without cost. Others answer with theology. The gods became more distant after the flood, working through intermediaries rather than walking openly. Others answer with politics. New gods rose because new cities rose. Old gods were reorganized, like officials reassigned under a new king. All of these answers can coexist in the same culture, and that is another thing I find strangely comforting about Mesopotamia. It did not demand one clean explanation. It allowed layers, and as we move into the next part, we will take one more layer in our hands, a layer that begins to appear when later ages look back at the tablets with different eyes. It is the layer of withdrawal, not a goddess descending for a season, but a civilization slowly losing the rituals that made gods present. A temple door that opens less often, a statue that is dressed with less care, a hymn that is remembered with fewer voices. We will walk through that slow fading, and we will watch how a god can be alive in a city one century and become a name in a scholar's book the next, without any single person noticing the exact day the change happened. For now, stay close to the fire. Let the image of 7 gates drift through your mind like a slow counting. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then silence. If you like, imagine the story as a tablet, not smooth paper, not a glowing screen, but a small rectangle of clay, the color of dried riverbank. The surface is not flat. It is dimpled with wedge marks, each one pressed by a reed stylus into wet earth, then left to harden. There is something tender about that, the way a human hand chose to save a thought by pushing it into mud. If you were standing beside me, I would hand you an invisible stylus and let you feel the motion. A small angle, a second stroke, a third, tiny decisions, repeated until a line becomes a sentence, until a sentence becomes a myth that can outlast the mouth that first spoke it. When I think about Inanna at the gates, I think about the scribe who had to slow down enough to write it. There is no rushing when you are making wedges in clay. You press, you lift, you wipe the stylus clean. Your breathing sets the pace. The lamp beside you sputters. Somewhere outside, the river makes that low sound. Rivers make at night, like a throat clearing in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, that is why the underworld and these myths feel so procedural. It is written like a list because it had to be made one mark at a time. Gate 1, remove this. Gate 2, remove that. Gate 3, the same again. It is almost like a lullaby made of rules, a lullaby made of counting. Sometimes I picture the underworld judges, the Anunnaki, as nothing more than the feeling of that list, the feeling that the world has steps, and those steps do not change for anyone, not even a goddess, not even a king. That is a hard truth, but it is also a steady truth, steady enough to rest against. So let the clay be heavy in your imagination for a moment. Let it sit in your palm. Let the dust gather at the edges of the wedges. Let the candlelight glide across each mark, turning shadow into meaning, then back into shadow again. The fading does not happen like a door slamming. It happens like the last ember on a hearth, still warm, still glowing, but quieter each minute, until you are not sure when the warmth finally became only ash. When people ask what happened to the Anunnaki after they left, I always want to answer gently, the way you might answer a child asking where yesterday went. Yesterday did not walk away on feet, it turned into today. And the Anunnaki, in the oldest written tradition we have, do something similar. They do not vanish with a single proclamation. They transform. They are absorbed. They are reorganized. They are moved from the bright rooms of the temple into the back corridors of memory, and then, slowly, into silence. You can feel the beginning of that shift in the way empires change language. Sumerian is one kind of music. Akkadian is another. When Sargon of Akkad builds his empire, when the city-states begin to bend under a larger authority, the gods begin to bend too, not because they are weak, but because human beings need their divine order to mirror their political order. A god who rules one city is perfect for a world of many rival cities. A god who rules everything is useful when one city begins to rule the rest. So names begin to slide. An becomes Anu. Inanna becomes Ishtar. Enki is spoken as Ea in Semitic tongues. Like a river, renamed as it crosses a border. Still the same water, still carrying the same silt, but called something new by the mouths that drink it. This is syncretism, the scholars say, and they are right. But I like to imagine it as a kind of marriage, sometimes affectionate, sometimes forced, sometimes practical. A new people arrives, and instead of burning the old temples, they step inside them. They learn the rituals, they adopt the local gods, and then they gently reshape them, the way hands reshape clay. The Anunnaki in early texts feel like the High Council, the decision makers, the ones who decree fates. In later periods, the council still exists, but the world around it has changed. The scribes start describing heaven like a government office. Roles become titles. Functions become departments. The divine becomes a chart. You can sense the old intimacy thinning. When the gods are fed daily, dressed daily, bathed daily, they feel present. Their statues are bodies. Their temples are homes. Their ziggurats are bridges. But what happens when the economy shifts? What happens when war empties the granaries? What happens when a king loses power, and the temple loses funding, and the daily offerings become smaller, and the priests become fewer? The god still has a name, still has a story, but the physical routine that made the god feel near begins to fray. I want you to picture one morning in a later century when the temple doors open more slowly. The air is cold. The stone steps are damp with night. A servant carries bread that is not quite as fresh as it used to be. A priest recites the hymn with a throat that is dry. The lamp oil is measured carefully because the storehouse is not full. No one says the gods are leaving, but everyone feels, in small ways, that the world is tightening. This is how distance begins. Then comes the great theological consolidation. Babylon rises, and with it the priests lift Marduk, once a city god, into the role of supreme ruler. The story is given a new frame, the creation epic that later scholars call Enuma Elish. In it, Marduk defeats Tiamat, the chaos sea, and from her body forms the world. The older gods gather, frightened, and they hand him authority. It is politics written into myth. A city becomes an empire, and its god becomes king of the cosmos. And the Anunnaki, they are still there, but their place is altered. They become administrators, a divine civil service. They maintain order. They carry out decrees. The center of gravity shifts away from them. You can almost hear it in the language. Less about personality, more about function. Less about gods walking, more about gods ruling through law. And then there is the underworld shift we touched the edges of already, where Anunnaki becomes a name associated with judges below rather than rulers above. One term can hold multiple meanings across centuries, and that looseness allows a tradition to survive, but it also blurs the image. The more blurred the image becomes, the easier it is to forget. Then, far later, come the pressure waves from new religions with sharper boundaries. Zoroastrianism arrives with its clean split between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and lie. A morally ambiguous pantheon is hard to fit into that system. Old gods can be reclassified as spirits, or demons, or simply mistakes. Then Christianity spreads, carrying a different kind of sacred. One God, jealous, exclusive, with no need for daily feeding, no need for statues dressed in linen. A sacred that lives in texts and hearts more than in mud brick rooms. The old temples struggle under that idea, and then, later still, Islam arrives with another powerful monotheism, another clear refusal of many gods. Under these new frameworks, the old names become suspect. Either they are nothing, or they are something dangerous. This is one of the most haunting things about religious change. It is not always a debate of ideas. It is often a practical collapse. If the priests cannot maintain the statue, the god has no body. If the offerings stop, the god grows thin in the imagination. If the writing system that holds the hymns falls out of daily use, the god loses its voice. Cuneiform, that beautiful wedge script, becomes an expert craft, a scribal art, then a priestly secret, then a puzzle, then, for centuries, a silence. The last known cuneiform texts are late, astonishingly late. Astronomical tablets, technical documents, the kind of writing that lingers when poetry is already faded, because specialists keep their tools longer than storytellers do. Imagine a scholar in a late temple school, tracing stars, keeping a tradition alive, like a small candle in a wind. Then, even that candle goes out, and the temples, without their daily care, become ruins. Brick returns to dust. Stairways crumble. The summit shrines that were once bedchambers for gods become places where birds sit. Yet, even in decline, nothing disappears completely. There were holdouts. Heron, for example. a city sacred to the moon god, Sin, continued to preserve old astral worship long after the political empires of Mesopotamia had fallen. Travelers wrote about people there, sometimes called Sabians in later sources, who still honored the celestial powers, still kept rituals that smelled faintly of Babylon and Sumer. I picture a night in Haran. The moon is sharp, the air is thin. A small group gathers on a roof. Someone pours water into a bowl, and the water catches the moonlight. Someone murmurs a prayer that has survived through translation and adaptation, like a song learned by ear after the original sheet music is lost. The old gods are not shouted anymore. They are breathed. This is the last stage of a tradition. Not a roaring crowd, but a few quiet hands. And even after the rituals stop, the patterns remain. You live by them without noticing. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, a circle of 360 degrees. These are Babylonian choices, sexagesimal mathematics, born from priestly astronomy. The way we cut time is a fossil of the old sacred order. The Anunnaki are not named in your calendar, but the structure that once served their heavens still shapes your day. And when later religions built their own cosmic hierarchies, they often used the same bones. Divine councils become angelic courts. Planetary deities become planetary angels. Old stories become new stories with new names, and the old gods slide into the background like ink beneath fresh paint. Biblical scholarship has long noticed it with the flood story, with creation motifs, with the tower reaching the heavens. Not plagiarism, not simple copying, more like cultural breathing in and out. People lived near each other. They traded, fought, married, were exiled, returned. Stories crossed borders like smoke. In some early Hebrew passages, you can hear a council behind the singular voice, a divine assembly, a court. Later, as monotheism tightens, the council becomes angels, servants, messengers. This is what old gods become. When the world chooses one god, they become attendants, or they become opponents, or they become metaphors, or they become something no one can name anymore, only feel. So when you ask, what happened to the Anunnaki after they left? One calm answer is this: they did not leave in a ship. They left in a slow drift of relevance. They left as language changed, as political structures changed, as temples lost their daily rhythm, as new faiths arrived with new frameworks, and as the writing system that held their names turned from a living tool into a dead script. And yet, there is always that other kind of answer, the one that returns in the modern imagination like a shadow returning at dusk, the ancient astronaut answer, the claim that the gods were visitors and that their absence is a literal departure. We will treat that claim with a steady hand, not mockery, not fear, just care, because it matters how people feel when they read these texts. It matters why this interpretation is seductive. It offers a clean ending, a dramatic exit, a reason for the silence. But the clay tablets themselves, as most credentialed scholars insist, do not speak in that clean way. They speak in mythic language, in ritual language, in the vocabulary of a world where heaven was not outer space. The question persists, because silence invites stories, and in the next part, we will step into that modern hunger. We will listen to the arguments. We will touch the word Nibiru, and we will feel how one astronomical term can become an entire world in the imagination. We will also feel the weight of scholarly critique, the slow, patient work of translation that does not bend easily to wishful readings. For now, let your thoughts settle on the image of a temple door. Once, it opened every morning. Then, it opened only for festivals. Then, only when a few elders insisted. Then, not at all. And the god did not scream as it faded. It simply grew quiet, like a room after the last footsteps have gone, leaving only dust and candlelight and the soft breath of time. If you have ever held a small object that belonged to someone long dead, you know the feeling I mean. A cold coin, a broken ring, a pottery shard with a fingerprint pressed into it, as if the past reached forward and touched you. Cuneiform tablets can do that to you, even behind glass. I remember standing once in a museum hush, staring at a tablet no larger than a hand, its surface crowded with wedges. The labels said something clinical, an inventory, an omen text, maybe a school exercise, but the wedges themselves were intimate. Each mark was made by pressure. Each mark was made by someone who had a day, a body, a pulse. The strangest part is realizing that when the last scribe pressed the last wedge, he did not know he was last. No one stands up and declares, "This is the final line of a religion." It ends the way languages end, the way childhood ends. One day, you say a word without realizing it will be the last time you say it. One day the teacher dies, and the students do not take new students. One day a tablet cracks, and no one makes another. So the Anunnaki, too, end without a final scene. Their temples become layers in the ground. Their statues are buried, broken, melted, or carried away. Their hymns remain only as patterns in clay, patterns that will sleep in the earth until modern hands lift them again. And even modern hands do not always agree on what they mean. Some scholars argue about whether Anunnaki was ever a fixed roster of gods, or a flexible label for whatever council a city needed at a given time. It is debated how sharply to divide the Anunnaki from the Igigi. How much is theology, and how much is later editorial habit? These are gentle debates, the kind held in libraries, but they matter because they remind us that the ancient world was not a single voice. It was a chorus, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes out of tune. That uncertainty can be comforting. It means we are not forced into one rigid conclusion. We can rest in the idea that the past is a little blurred, as all deep time is blurred and still meaningful. So take a slow breath with me. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders sink, as if the weight of 1,000 years could slide off you and into the floorboards. The story is dark, yes, but it is also patient. And patience is one of the kindest things time can teach. The modern hunger for a clean ending is easy to understand. When you stand in the ruins of an old city and feel the wind move through broken brick, you want a reason. You want a final sentence. You want someone to step forward and say, "This is why the temples emptied. This is why the statues fell silent. This is why the gods stopped answering." Silence is uncomfortable. Silence invites imagination. So, in recent decades, a different story has grown around the Anunnaki. A story that treats the ancient texts not as myth and theology, but as coded memory. The claim is simple enough to repeat in one breath. The Anunnaki were not gods at all, but visitors, beings from elsewhere, and their disappearance was an actual departure. If you have ever listened to a person tell you a theory late at night, eyes bright, voice low, you know the pull of it. It feels like a secret door in a familiar wall. It feels like a way to turn the slow fading of history into a dramatic event you can point to, date, and picture. And because we are here for sleep, not for argument, we can hold that pull gently. We can admit it is seductive without letting it grab us by the throat. The most famous modern voice attached to this interpretation is Zecharia Sitchin, whose books reshaped popular imagination about Mesopotamia. In his telling, the Anunnaki came to Earth for resources, created humans as a workforce, and eventually left when their mission was done, or when internal conflicts made staying impossible, or when their homeworld returned close enough for evacuation. He named that homeworld Nibiru. Nibiru becomes, in this modern myth, a wandering planet with a long, sweeping orbit. It becomes a stage on which every ancient symbol can be recast as technology. Winged discs become craft. Celestial boats become rockets. Gods holding buckets become beings carrying devices. It is a complete narrative. It has villains and factions. It has timelines. It has a satisfying final exit. And it tries to attach that exit to real, historical tremors. The collapse of Sumer around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the decline in monumental building, the way later texts speak of gods becoming distant, even the visions of prophets, the strange wheels and lights described by Ezekiel are pulled into the net, offered as eyewitness accounts of something mechanical. You can see why it catches people. It offers a single thread that ties everything together. But here is the quiet problem, the one that keeps returning like a steady bell tone in the work of trained Assyriologists and historians. The thread depends on translation. It depends on reading ancient words as if they were technical labels rather than mythic images. It depends on pulling lines from different periods and treating them as a single coherent record, as if thousands of years of evolving religion were one tidy journal. Most credentialed scholars of Sumerian and Akkadian reject Sitchin's translations and conclusions, not as a matter of taste, but as a matter of language. They point to errors in grammar, in context, in the meanings of key terms. They point out that Mesopotamian texts are not hiding a spacecraft manual. They are doing what myths do. They turn the ungraspable into images the mind can hold. I like to imagine, at this point in the night, someone walking through a museum after closing, not the crowded midday shuffle. The lights are lowered, the air cool, the glass cases quietly reflecting each other. A guard's footsteps move in slow intervals across the floor, and the whole building seems to breathe through its vents. Inside one case, a tablet waits, fired clay, wedges pressed by hands that never knew electricity, yet still speaking across 4,000 years. And here we are, reading those wedges and hearing engines. It is not foolish. It is human. We live in an age that understands the heavens as a place you can travel, if only your vehicle is advanced enough. So our metaphors lean toward craft and corridors of space. The ancient astronaut theory is, in a way, our modern language for an older theme. Something came down, something went up, and the world was changed. But the clay tablets do not always cooperate with modern shapes. Mesopotamian tradition is not one book with one author. It is many voices across cities, dynasties, languages, and centuries. Stories get copied, adjusted, recast. A title becomes a name becomes a role. The same idea appears with different faces, depending on who is telling it. That is why scholars are cautious, and this is where claims about Nibiru often soften. In Babylonian astronomical texts, Nibiru appears, yes, but not as a hidden planet on a vast, rare orbit. It behaves more like a visible celestial reference, sometimes identified with Jupiter, sometimes tied to the idea of a crossing point. The sky is a calendar in those texts, not a doorway for secret arrivals. Even if you set language aside, there is the physical world. Archaeology finds brilliance, but it is a human brilliance. Mud brick, bitumen, reed, copper, careful drainage, stamped bricks, stairways worn smooth by feet. Ziggurats are sacred mountains built by labor and devotion. They do not read like platforms for machines. They read like architecture designed to hold presence, to give the divine a room. So the modern departure story ends up answering a feeling more than a fact. It answers the feeling of absence. It answers the ache that says, the gods were once closer, and the older myths answer that ache in their own way, without rockets. In the flood stories, after catastrophe, boundaries harden. The gods become more distant, working through omens and dreams and priestly rituals. In Gilgamesh, the hero discovers he cannot force the divine to grant what it withholds, and he cannot even stay awake. Sleep takes him, easily, like a tide. If you let that settle, it becomes oddly calming. You do not have to conquer everything. You are allowed to be human. You are allowed to close your eyes. So perhaps the most faithful way to hold the modern theory is to place it as one more layer of myth. Born from an era that thinks in planets and machines, it translates divine distance into our vocabulary. And that brings us to the third possibility, quieter than both extremes. What if the real question is not where did they go, but what happens when a culture stops feeding its gods? Because in Mesopotamia, the gods needed feeding. They needed dressing. They needed songs. Their presence depended on a daily choreography. When that choreography ended, the gods did not have to fly away. They simply had no doorway left in the world. Imagine a temple, not abandoned in a single day, but thinning. Offerings shrink. Lamp oil is rationed. Songs shorten. The bedchamber at the summit grows cold. Then one morning the doors do not open, not with a final decree, but with a quiet lack of hands. No spacecraft required, just time. In the next part, we will step deeper into that layer of memory and consciousness, into the way the sacred migrates when old forms break, and how old gods transform into new names, new roles, new structures. For now, rest on the image of that museum case. The guard pauses, looks at the tablet, cannot read the signs, yet feels deep time anyway. His keys jingle softly as he moves on, and the tablet remains, patient, as if it has all the time in the world, because it does. Outside the museum, the city keeps its own late-night rhythm. A distant car hushes by on wet pavement. Somewhere, a river under a bridge makes the same sound it made when Uruk was young. You can almost believe the water remembers everything, yet never speaks. Let your thoughts drift with that water now, slow, dark, calm, carrying us toward the next doorway. Hey there, come a little closer to the fire. I know the story has carried us through ruins and tablets and councils of gods, and I can feel how the weight of time can make the chest tighten if we hold it too firmly. So let us loosen our grip. Let the past be heavy, yes, but not heavy in your body. Breathe in slowly, breathe out even slower. The jaw softens, the tongue rests, the shoulders drop, as if they have been waiting for permission to stop performing. Now, here is the quietest layer of this whole question, the layer that feels less like history and more like a whisper inside the human mind. When the old texts ask where the gods are, they are not only asking about beings, they are asking about experience. The religion scholar Rudolf Otto used the word numinous for that quality, that feeling of standing before something that is both fascinating and unsettling. The way candlelight can make a room feel safe and strange at the same time. The Anunnaki, in their original setting, carried that feeling. They were the name for powers that made sense of storms, rivers, harvests, kingship, plague, and the shifting luck of a city. In the earliest Sumerian imagination, the sacred was not far away. It was in the wind. It was in the floodwater. It was in the sound of reed beds moving. The world was thick with presence. And then, slowly, the presence migrated, not because it disappeared, but because human life changed. I have always found it strange that as our explanations grow more precise, our sense of awe does not vanish. It just finds new places to live. The storm becomes meteorology, but the feeling of mystery does not die. It moves into the laws that govern weather, into the mathematics that predicts a flood, into the idea of order itself. In Mesopotamia, you can almost watch that migration happening. At first, the gods feel like neighbors. They eat offerings. They argue. They make mistakes. They sulk. They intervene. Later, as empires grow, the gods become more like principals, more like offices in a vast administration, more distant. Their speech becomes omen. Their touch becomes ritual. Their presence becomes something you infer rather than something you meet face to face. Then come the monotheisms, each with their own kind of distance. One god, beyond nature. Not in the storm, but the maker of the storm. Not in the river, but the giver of the riverbed. The sacred becomes transcendent rather than immanent. The gods of place and function become obsolete, not necessarily because they were childish, but because the shape of society demanded something universal. This is where the story can feel like progress, and also like loss. Some scholars argue that the move from many gods to one reflects a growing abstraction, a kind of philosophical refinement. Others caution, gently, that this is a bias, a habit of ranking religions as if they were rungs on a ladder. Polytheistic systems can be sophisticated in their own way, able to hold paradox and locality with a kind of calm that strict universality sometimes lacks. So, did the Anunnaki fade because we outgrew them? Or did they fade because the world became too large for city gods to hold? Or did they fade because new moral frameworks demanded a different sacred grammar? We cannot be sure, but we can be sure of this. The sacred did not stop. It shifted its mask. And when a mask shifts, the old mask does not always get thrown away. Sometimes it is hung quietly in the back room of culture, still present, still influencing the shape of the next performance. You can see the back room if you look in the right places. The biblical flood story echoes Mesopotamian flood stories, not as simple copying, but as shared breath across neighboring cultures, across exile and return, across centuries of listening and retelling. The creation from clay, too. The tower that reaches toward heaven. These motifs travel like dust on sandals. Even the idea of a divine council survives, sometimes hidden. In early Hebrew texts, Elohim can sound plural, like a court. Later, the court becomes angels, servants of a single throne. The structure remains even when the names change. In Islamic angelology, and in later esoteric traditions, planetary hierarchies and celestial administrators still appear, patterns that feel strangely similar to Mesopotamian cosmic bureaucracy. Again, not a straight line, not a secret conspiracy, just the way ideas persist when they are useful. And then there is the simplest persistence of all, time itself. An hour divided into 60, a circle into 360 degrees. These are Babylonian choices, the lingering skeleton of priestly astronomy. You live inside that skeleton every day, without needing to believe in the gods who once gave it meaning. This is a kind of immortality, not to be worshipped, but to be embedded. So when you ask, what happened to the Anunnaki? You can answer in 3 soft layers. Historically, they transformed through syncretism, politics, theological evolution, and the slow collapse of temple life. Mythically, they withdrew, the way gods withdraw after a catastrophe, leaving humans to navigate with omens and dreams and the quiet work of priests. Psychologically, they migrated. The numinous that once lived in their names moved into new names, new symbols, new frameworks, and the old names became fossils, then curiosities, then sparks for modern stories about aliens and lost worlds, because we still feel the same hunger their myths once fed. And maybe the deepest answer is not about them at all. Maybe it is about us. We are the species that builds a ladder toward heaven, then forgets the ladder, then builds another. We are the species that presses wedges into clay to stop a thought from dying, then loses the ability to read the wedges, then relearns it, then wonders what else we have forgotten. You know that feeling when you try to recall a dream in the morning and it slips away, not because it is gone, but because it will not hold still long enough to be pinned down? That is how I imagine the Anunnaki in the modern mind. A dream of an ancient presence, not entirely real in the way stone is real, not entirely unreal in the way a random fantasy is unreal, but real in their effects, in the way they shaped a civilization, in the way their stories still shape our imagination. If you listen carefully, you can hear how a civilization's beliefs change, not as a shout, more as a change in acoustics. At first, the sacred is loud, It is in the crash of thunder. It is in the sudden flood that turns a field into a sea. It is in the fever that arrives without warning. When life is exposed, the divine feels close because the world itself feels close, close enough to bruise you. Then, bit by bit, humans build buffers, irrigation channels, walls, granaries, laws, writing. These buffers are beautiful. They are how we survive. But each buffer also changes the sound of the sacred. The storm is still frightening, but now you can predict it. The flood is still dangerous, but now you can redirect it. Sometimes the fever is still mysterious, but now you have herbs, rituals, careful isolation. As we gain control, the gods do not necessarily vanish. They move upward. They become the ones who decree the order that makes control possible. This is what a scholar might call abstraction, but you can feel it more simply as distance. The sacred gets quieter, farther away, and the human heart starts listening harder. That is why a divine council makes sense in the Sumerian world. It mirrors their own councils, their own kings, their own archives. The cosmos becomes an administration because their cities become administrations. The Anunnaki become, in a way, the ultimate clerks of reality, stamping destiny the way a scribe stamps a tablet. And yet, the numinous is not only in order, it is also in the places where order fails. A drought, a plague, a war that shatters a wall you thought would stand forever. Those moments reawaken the old feeling, the tremor that says, there is something beyond our plans. This is why the old gods rarely disappear cleanly. When a new faith rises, it does not erase the old world like a sponge. It repaints it. Old gods become demons because the new story needs an enemy, or old gods become angels because the new story needs a hierarchy, or old gods become saints because people cannot bear to lose a beloved face of the sacred. Even when official religion changes, the folk memory lingers in small habits. A grandmother who still leaves a bit of bread near a threshold, a farmer who still whispers to the river, a traveler who still feels the need to pause at a ruin, to touch the stone, as if touching can bridge time. I think about Heron sometimes, that late stronghold of moon worship, the place where the old rites persisted long after empires had shifted. Imagine walking there at night, the moon above like a pale coin, and hearing hymns that had been sung for thousands of years, sung by people who knew the world had changed, but kept singing anyway. There is something tender in that stubbornness. There is also something eerily calm. It tells you that meaning is not only something imposed from above. Meaning is something humans cultivate, the way you cultivate a garden, by returning to it, by watering it with attention. And when attention moves elsewhere, the garden grows wild. The Anunnaki, from this perspective, did not explode into nothingness. They grew wild in the human imagination. Their names stopped being spoken daily. Their rituals stopped being performed. Their statues stopped being bathed. But the shapes of them, the patterns, the sense of councils and decrees and cosmic administration kept slipping into new stories. This is why you can read later texts and feel echoes. It is why you can read a monotheistic scripture and still hear, faintly, the sound of older councils behind the throne. It is why you can watch modern science fiction and recognize the same ancient pulse, beings from the sky, teachers, judges, the fear that humanity is being watched. You might say, we keep reinventing the Anunnaki. Or you might say, the Anunnaki never left. Because what they really were was a way to hold the numinous, and we still need to hold it. Here, beside the fire, that need can feel very simple. You want the world to make sense. You want suffering to have a pattern. You want your small life to be part of a larger story. Even if the larger story is dark, even if it includes catastrophe and collapse, it is still a story, and story is a kind of shelter. So let the shelter be gentle. Let the heavy questions be folded neatly, like blankets. Let the mind stop trying to solve everything. You can think of the Anunnaki as gods, if that brings you calm. You can think of them as a cultural idea, if that feels safer. You can think of them as a mirror, reflecting the human need to name the powers that shape us. Any of these is fine tonight. The important thing is the softness. And maybe, as a final image, let us return to clay, because clay is where this whole journey began. Clay is wet earth. It holds fingerprints. It holds nails and lines. It records the pressure of a stylus, the way a pillow records the shape of a head. When the Sumerian scribe pressed wedges into clay, he was doing something intimate. He was turning breath into mark, thought into matter. He was saying, I do not want this to vanish. And the clay listened. It listened through the fall of empires, through fire that baked it harder, through sand that buried it, through the long patience of the ground. Now, when you close your eyes, you are doing something similar. You are letting the day sink back into the earth of memory. You are letting thoughts soften. You are letting the sharp edges dissolve. You do not have to remember everything. You do not have to solve the riddle of where gods go. You only have to breathe, slowly, steadily, as if your ribs were old wooden beams in a quiet temple, rising and falling, with a rhythm that has nothing to prove. The fire crackles. The candlelight trembles. Water moves somewhere in the dark, unseen but faithful. Dust settles where no one will disturb it. And the sacred, whatever it truly is, does what it has always done. It shifts. It changes form. It waits. Good night.